Welcome to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and today we are going to talk about Kautilya's Arthashastra and the debate that revolves around it. Before I talk about the debate, I think it is important to first, discuss about Kautilya himself and his Arthashastra, the structure of Arthashastra particularly. So, as I think most of you would know, that Kautilya's Arthashastra is a manual of statecraft that is addressed to a king and their advisors, or sometimes would-be advisors. And in the Arthashastra, a terms appear which is called Vijigishu. Now, Vijigishu is the would-be conqueror. So, this text is for those who want to, establish a particular society in a particular way. So this was the main purpose of Arthashastra. Now, when we read the Arthashastra, there is not many instances where the name Cortillia appears, and most of the time, Cortillia is talking about in third person. So the phrase which you see is iti Kautilya, meaning so says Kautilya. So what we see is that in the Arthashastra, most of the time the name which is used is Kautilya. There is only one instance where the term Chanakya appears, and this happens at the end of the 15th chapter. And this final verse which tells us about Chanakya goes like this: the one who in his wrath quickly rescued the Shastra, the weapon and the earth that had fallen to the Nanda kings, he wrote this Shastra. So that is how the text ends, and from this verse we get to know that the person who wrote this had a name called Chanakya, or most of the time the term Kautilya appears. Now the term Kautilya, most scholars believe, was the Gotra name of Chanakya or Vishnugupta. And same is true for the name Vishnugupta. We find that the name Vishnugupta also appears at the end. So the verse where this term Vishnugupta for the author appears goes like this: having seen the many inconsistencies of the commentators on Shastras, Vishnugupta himself composed the Sutra and the Bhashya. So that is how we see, from this particular verse, some scholars have argued that Vishnugupta was also the name of the author Kautilya. And now let's talk about the text Arthashastra itself and how it is structured. Now, when we see the evidence of the Arthashastra, we see that there are a handful of manuscripts that we have, the presently which we have. And the oldest manuscript of Arthashastra dates back to around 12th century. And what is interesting about this manuscript is that this manuscript is incomplete. And the complete manuscript, from which we have our translation and most of our knowledge of Arthashastra that comes from, this complete manuscripts, these have around 5,392 passages. And these passages are also in prose and in verse. And most scholars are of the opinion that there was no versions or recensions of Arthashastra. What the text which we have was most likely the text which was composed by the author himself. So there was no major versions of Arthashastra that were later authored tried to change this text. So this is one aspect. Now, when we analyze the Arthashastra itself, we find that Arthashastra is divided into 15 books. The term which is used in the text is called Adhikarana. So Arthashastra is divided into 15 Adhikarans, and each Adhikaran talks about provides a general sense of the content of a particular Adhikaran. So for example, Adhikaran 10 is on war, and it is called Sangramika, which means on war. For another example would be Adhikaran 13, which is called Durgalambhopaya, meaning strategy for taking a fortress. So you can see how, the name of a particular adhikaran conveys what this adhikaran is going to tell us, what this adhikaran is all about. And when we analyze these 15 adhikaran, we find that the book, the adhikaran 2, which is called Adhyaksh Prachar, is the oldest. Is the longest. And Adhyaksh Prachar basically talks about, how officials should be governed and how they should be looked by the king or the ministers. And book 11 or Adhikaran 11, which is called Sanghavritta. Sanghavritta meaning practices against republic, is the shortest one. So this is, the broad overview of the different adhikarans of Arthashastra. Now, although in the Arthashastra it is not explicitly stated, but the later commentators, when they analyzed or made commentaries on Arthashastra, they viewed that the first 13 adhikaran of Arthashastra can be divided into two different themes. So the first 5 adhikarans are on Tantra. Tantra means domestic affairs. So the first 1 to 5 adhikarans deals with Tantra, which means domestic affairs, and 5 adhikarana 6 to 13 deals with Avap. So this is the term which is used. Avap means foreign affairs. So from adhikaran 1 to 5, we have discussion on internal affairs. From 6 to 13, we have discussion on external affairs. So this is the broad overview of how the Arthashastra is structured. Now the later two adhikaran, so the adhikaran 14 and adhikaran 15 deals with different topics. So, but the broad thematic difference is there in the first 13 adhikaran. So this is the broad structure of how Arthashastra itself is structured. Now, as I have already said that when it comes to the versions of Arthashastra, there is none. And most scholars believe that what we have in present is more or less the same version which the original author has composed. And but according to Patrick Olivelle believes that there is the text did not, there was no significant addition or alter or subtraction from the text, but the text was revised. And the reason for this revision, according to Patrick Olivelle, was that during after its composition, it was used as some kind of academic. It was used as some kind of academic curriculum. So, because it was used in academic curriculum, the person or the group of person who have revised the structure of this text. Now, what we see is that they have divided the original topics or chapters of Arthashastra into a more coherent structure. And the reason for this division or revision was that in order to teach a particular student or a group of student, they needed a form of a structure that would be quite easy to to teach or to comprehend or even to be comprehended by the students. So that is why we see that this broad category of a particular chapter dealing with a particular subject. That is why we see this is the case. So it is because of the fact that Arthashastra, after its composition, became part of a curriculum, academic curriculum, and that is why we see that this division between chapters dealing with a particular subject. And incidentally, according to Patrick Olivelle, the fact that it became a academic curriculum, part of academic curriculum, was the main reason why it survived. Otherwise, like many of the text that this particular Arthashastra talks about, like these texts, this text would also have been lost, but that didn't happen because of the mainly because it became a academic curriculum. So now, so this is the broad overview of Arthashastra and the date of Arthashastra. Now, about the content of the Arthashastra. Now let's talk about the debate about its historicity and about its authorship. Now, before we talk about this, what is the debate and what are the arguments presented by different historians, I think most of us are familiar with the traditional view, which is that Chanakya is Kautilya, and Vishnugupta was also his another name. So this is the traditional view, which I think most of us are familiar with. So the story goes that Kautilya exterminated the Nandas and established the Mauryan rule, and he was the minister of Chandragupta Maurya. And according to some view, that after serving under Chandragupta Maurya, when he retired, he composed this text Arthashastra. So this is what I think most of us are familiar with this story. So the main point of traditional view is that Chanakya or Kautilya are both the same authors, and Vishnugupta also, and they composed this text. This text was composed in the last decades of 4th century BC, and the text which we have in front of us is more or less the same text which Chanakya or Kautilya composed in the end of 4th century BC. So there was, according to the traditional view, there was no addition or any altercation or any changes that was done to the text by any author. So this is broadly the main the traditional view. Now the traditional view is basically comes from the story of Chanakya Chandragupta Katha, because I think most of us are familiar with this whole story of how Chanakya was insulted by the Nanda kings, and then he goes and finds Chandragupta, and he trains Chandragupta, and finally Chandragupta, with the help of Chanakya, overthrows the Nandas, and he became he becomes the new king. So this is the whole broad overview of the Chanakya Chandragupta Katha. And when we analyze the different sources, we find that there are multiple sources in which this Chanakya Chandragupta Katha is found. So there is first the Pali version. Now, when we look at the Pali version, we find that in Pali version is basically the Sri Lankan Buddhist text that has survived up until now. So the first Pali text is Deep Vamsh. Now in Deep Vamsh, we find that there is no mention of either Chanakya or Chandragupta. And Deep Vamsh is the earliest Pali work. Whereas when we move to Mahavamsh, according to most scholars, was composed between 5th century AD and 6th century AD. So in Mahavamsh, we have, some reference to Chandragupta and Chanakya, and this, whole Chandragupta Chanakya Katha is also present, but not in detail. In detail, we find that this Katha of Chanakya and Chandragupta is present in a text called Mahavamsha Tika. And Mahavamsha Tika, according to most scholars, was composed between 1000 to 1250 AD. And this is a Sri Lankan Pali text. So the story which appears here is more or less the same. There are minor differences between different stories, but the overall structure of the story is same. Now then we move to the Jain version. Now I think most of us know that the earliest Jain sources, most of these sources have not survived, but the 12th century author or Jain thinker, whose name was Hemchandracharya, he wrote a text called Trishashti Shalak Purusha Charita. So in this text, so this basically means the life of 60 great men. I think this was the translation. So in Trishashti Shalak Purush Charita, we have a similar version of Chanakya Chandragupta Katha. And although there are some minor differences between the version which is present in the Pali texts and the Jain text, but broadly we can say that the story is same. There are, minor differences because, so for example, I think most of us remember that there is this, in the story, we are told that, when Chanakya was born, he had a full set of teeth. So in the Pali version, we are told that Chanakya himself, destroyed or broke his teeth because his father did not wanted him to have a full teeth at a younger age. And in the Jain version, we are told that his father was the person who broke his full teeth. So this is some minor differences between the two texts. Then we find that in the Kashmir, there is also a Kashmiri version of this Chanakya Chandragupta Katha. So I think most of us have heard this text called Katha Sarit Sagar. So Katha Sarit Sagar of Somdev has this story. Then Kshemendra's Brihat Katha Manjari also have this story. Then there is this text which is now lost called Brihat Katha of Gunadhya. So most scholars believe that the Chanakya Chandragupta Katha was there in the Brihat Katha of Gunadhya. And later, the author of Brihat Katha Manjari and Katha Sarit Sagar, both of them borrowed this story from the original story that was present in Brihat Katha of Gunadhya. So these are the three, versions which I think most of us have not heard about. But the main version which most of us know about is Vishakdatt's Mudra Rakshas. This is a drama that was composed between 4th to 5th century AD. And the whole story is told in 7 acts. And the basic overview which most of us know comes from this drama. And there is also a classical version where, a Greek version but what we see is that the story is quite different, and most of the time, there are major differences. So I'm not going to discuss the classical version itself, but what does all of these versions tell us that during the start of the Gupta period, this story of Katha Manjari, Chandragupta Chanakya Katha has become quite popular. And the fact that from Kashmir to Sri Lanka, all of the major text has this story shows that this story has now become very widely popular. And the fact that up until the 12th and 13th century, when Hemchandra Acharya or the Mahavamsh Tika, when these texts were being written, the story had survived up until then, shows that the story had become quite popular. Now, the scholar who has analyzed these different versions of Chandragupta Chanakya Katha is Trautmann. And according to Trautmann, he believes that, although we have a Jain version and the Pali version, both of these versions draw from independent sources. And according to Trautmann, this Chanakya Chandragupta Katha was composed in the region of Magad. And there existed an early version of this Katha. And from this early version, we see that, all of the different sources have borrowed the story. So the early version, which we can say, we are not sure whether it was written down or it was passed orally, but it appears that the Chanakya Chandragupta Katha was composed in the Magadhan region, and from the region of Magad, it spread throughout the Indian subcontinent. So this is the broad overview of what is the traditional view, and from where we see that this traditional view is based. Modern scholars, I think from the beginning, when this Arthashastra was first discovered, and when R. Shamasastri translated it in English, we see that some scholars have raised objection about the historicity of this text, about the date of this text, and the authorship of the text. So for example, Vincent Smith, I think most of us have heard his name. So when the translation of the Arthashastra by R. Shamasastri in English appeared, he raised objection and he argued that this text is of a later date. It was not composed in the early Mauryan period, and particularly not by a person called Chanakya. So this was his view. Now, broad arguments of those scholars who oppose this traditional view that Chanakya and Kautilya are the same, and Chanakya was the person who wrote this Arthashastra, and Arthashastra was written at the early stages of Mauryan history. So against this, we see that there are some arguments which scholars have presented. So I'm going to go through these arguments. So the first argument is that when you look at the different versions of Chanakya Chandragupta Katha, for example, let's say we are looking at the Pali version, the Kashmiri version, or the classical version, or the Jain version, and even in Mudra Rakshas, we find that nowhere we are told that it was Kautilya or Chanakya who wrote Arthashastra, and Arthashastra never appears in this Katha, Chanakya Chandragupta Katha. So according to these scholars, the fact that since Arthashastra was a so important text, and the fact that we don't have any reference of Arthashastra in the different versions of Chanakya Chandragupta Katha, tells us that this Chanakya was a different person, and the person who wrote Arthashastra, whose name was Cortillia, was a different person. And it was, in the Gupta period, we see that both of these identities were coalesced into a single identity. So this is the first argument. Now about the name Chanakya and Chandragupta. So the argument, that these two personalities, that is Kautilya and Chanakya, are different. Basically, the main evidence from this, according to these scholars, is that when you look at the different versions of Chanakya Chandragupta Katha, only Mudra Rakshas tells us that there is this connection between, tells us that Chanakya is Kautilya, and Kautilya is basically the Gotra name of Chanakya. So it is only in Mudra Rakshas we find that this connection between Kautilya and Chanakya has been made. In no other version of Chandragupta Chanakya Katha, we see that there is this, we are told that both Kautilya and Chanakya are the same one. And when you read Mudra Rakshas, it comments that, Kautilya the crooked one. So that is how we see in the Mudra Rakshas the term Kautilya appears, and that is how it is connected to Chanakya. Now one question which arises is that, as I have already told you, I think those of you remember that in the manuscript we see that the term Chanakya appears, and also the term Vishnugupta appears, and throughout the whole text we have Kautilya saying, we have the reference to Kautilya. So the term is iti Kautilya, meaning so says Kautilya. So if you are using this argument, so most scholars argue that there are only two verses where we have the name Vishnugupta, and there is one verse where we have the name Chanakya. So in both of these verses, where for example the verse with the name Chanakya and the verse with the name Vishnugupta, what we find is that these verses are added at the end of a chapter. So these verses are not found within the chapter, they are added at the end of the chapter when the chapter has ended. And what is even more important when it comes to the verse where the term Chanakya appears, according to scholars, the meter of the verse where this term Chanakya appears is entirely different from the meter which is used in the text. So the different meters which are found in Arthashastra is not the same as the meter which is used in this verse which tells us about Chanakya. So the fact that whether we are talking about the verse which has the name Vishnugupta, or whether we are talking about the term whether we are talking about the verse which has the term Chanakya, both of these verses appears at the end of the chapter. This means that they were added later by someone else. They were not present when the author was composing his text. So this is the main argument about this. And according to Patrick Olivelle, he believes that so the one question which arises is that if you are saying that let's say we believe that Kautilya and Chanakya were different persons, so why we see that there is this there is this effort to connect these two personalities. So according to scholars, according to particularly Patrick Olivelle believes that this connection, this effort, or this attempt to connect the identity of Kautilya and Chanakya was not unintentional, it was intentional. And the intention of this can also be seen from the fact that this attempt to merge the identities of these two personalities also appears in Mudra Rakshas. So the main argument of Patrick Olivelle is that during the early Gupta or during the Gupta period, what we see is that there is this attempt by the Guptas to promote Arthashastra. And the reason of promoting Arthashastra, according to Patrick Olivelle, was that there was this sense of legitimacy which the Mauryan Empire had. And when the Guptas were trying to claim legitimacy, what they did was this text Arthashastra, which was composed by a person called Kautilya, and according to these scholars that this text was composed in the early Gupta period. So this text was composed in the early Gupta period, and there was this personality called Chanakya that had existed in the Mauryan period. So by connecting these two personalities, what they are essentially doing, that is the Guptas, what the Guptas are essentially doing is that they are merging, they are claiming to have some connection with the imperial Mauryas. So essentially what is being done here by the Guptas is that in order to promote their view of the world, or how they saw the different polities, they promoted a text called Arthashastra, and to make it more what should we say, to make it more appealing to the masses or to the intellectuals, they connected this text to the person called Chanakya. And since the Chanakya Chandragupta Katha was very popular. So this connection with Chanakya suddenly made Arthashastra quite relevant, or even more popular. So ultimately, it is the promotion of Arthashastra was basically, the attempt by the Guptas to claim some legitimacy or to enhance their prestige. So this is the main argument of Patrick Olivelle. Now, since I have talked about, that Patrick Olivelle or other scholars who oppose the traditional view believes in the argument that the text, the Arthashastra was composed in the early Gupta period or slightly in the later modern period. In the later half of post-modern period. So if that is the case, what are their arguments? So let's see, what these scholars have to say about the date of Arthashastra. So first argument which these scholars make is that when you look at now the traditional, those scholars who support the traditional view, what they sometimes argue is that when you look at the arguments of Megasthenes, we find that when you look at the Megasthenes Indica, what we find is that sometimes we see that there are some similarity with the Arthashastra, what Arthashastra is talking and what Megasthenes is describing. So the fact that there is this similarity between the two texts, according to some traditional scholars who subscribe to the traditional view, these scholars believe that this shows that the Arthashastra was written in the early modern period when Chandragupta was reigning. Now these scholars who oppose this, they argue that first of all, the difference between what Megasthenes is saying, the similarity between what Megasthenes is saying and what Arthashastra is talking about is quite minute. There are few instances where we see that there is some similarity, whereas there are quite a lot of instances where we see that both of these are talking about completely different situations. So this is the first point. Then they argue is that what these scholars who oppose the traditional view, they argue that when you read Arthashastra, you get a sense that for Kautilya assumes that the Sanskrit in the royal edicts, Sanskrit should be used. Okay, so what Kautilya presumes the use of Sanskrit in royal edicts. But when you look at the archaeological sources or inscriptional sources, we find that it was only in the Gupta period the use of Sanskrit in royal edicts became popular. Or if you want to extend your argument, you can say that in the postmodern period, we see that there are some powers who have begun to use Sanskrit. But in the modern period, this was not the case. We all know that in the modern period, it was Prakrit that was used to write for royal edicts. So the fact that Kautilya presumes that Sanskrit will be used in royal edicts or means that he was writing this text at a time when Sanskrit was written in was used in royal edicts. This means that Kautilya was writing either in the end of postmodern period or at the start of the Gupta period. So this is one argument. Then we move to another argument which these scholars have mentioned, is that when Kautilya is describing the name of places, he talks about Chin. Now Chin is the term which is used for China, and according to these scholars, the term Chin originated only after the establishment of the Qin dynasty. And the Qin dynasty was established in 221 BC. Now 221 BC is, if you look at the history of India, was the period when the Mauryan Empire is declining. So what it shows is that either Kautilya must, now if we believe that, this is true, then for example, now Qin dynasty, comes to, Qin dynasty is established in 221 BC. Now, what we can assume is that it must have taken some time to become, to popularize this name China. So let's say it took around 100 years. So that means the term China would have, became popular in India around the close of Common Era. This would suggest that the Arthashastra was written at the close of Common Era. So this is, again, you can see how in the post, we can see that the Arthashastra was written in the post-modern period. The same is true for a term called Tamraparni. Now Tamraparni, if you read the Ashokan edicts, we find that in the Ashokan edicts, Tamraparni is used for Ceylon or Sri Lanka. But in the case of Arthashastra, Arthashastra uses Tamraparni for South India. And for Ceylon, we find that Arthashastra uses the term Par Samudra. So first argument is quite clear. I think that, if suppose we say that in the Ashokan period, Cortillia was writing in the Mauryan period, he would have used Tamraparni for Ceylon, but he is using it for South India. So there is this difference. Then the term for Ceylon, which is present in Arthashastra, is Par Samudra. Now Par Samudra, or a term similar to Par Samudra, appears in a text called Periplus of the Athenian Sea. And this text, this is a Greek text, according to most scholars, this text was written in 1st century AD or something around this period. And here for Ceylon, the term is used Palesameda, or I think I'm pronouncing it wrongly, but it is close to the pronunciation is close to this. So Palesameda or Par Samudra is there is some relation we can say between these two terms. So this would mean that Kautilya was writing at a period when Ceylon was known by the name of Par Samudra, particularly in India. And we have all seen that in the Mauryan period, particularly in the Ashokan period, Ceylon was known as Tamraparni. So the fact that, if we say that Arthashastra was written in the Mauryan period, Kautilya would have used the name Tamraparni. Instead, he used Par Samudra, and we see that Par Samudra, or some term similar to Par Samudra, is used in another Greek text which dates to around 1st century AD. So all of this means that Kautilya wrote his Arthashastra in the post-modern period, and this text was written by a person called Kautilya, and there is no relation between Kautilya and Chanakya. So this is the broad argument. So some additional arguments, just to enforce this point, the scholars argue that when you look at the legal passages of Arthashastra, most of these legal passages are similar, or are quite close to Yajnavalkya Smriti. And Yajnavalkya Smriti, if you and I think most of us know that Yajnavalkya Smriti was composed in 3rd or 4th century AD. So the fact that Yajnavalkya Smriti and the points which are raised in Yajnavalkya Smriti is similar to that of Arthashastra means that the period of composition of Arthashastra and the period of composition of Yajnavalkya Smriti is close to each other. This would mean that Arthashastra was written in the period of in the early Gupta period or in the postmodern period. Now, another argument which we see is that when you look at Kama Sutra of Vatsyayan, the way this text is structured is quite similar to that of Kautilya. This would mean that they were composed at the same period. So that is the main argument of these scholars. So to sum it up, the arguments of these scholars, they argue basically that Arthashastra was composed either in the postmodern period or it is composed in the early Gupta period. So and about the author of Arthashastra, they believe that a person called Kautilya wrote this text, and this Kautilya was not Chanakya. This Kautilya existed in a later period. So this is the broad argument of these historians who oppose the traditional view. Now to some arguments against these scholars. So the first argument, when we say when they argue that Megasthenes' account and the account of Arthashastra are quite dissimilar. So one can argue that when you read Megasthenes, first of all, the original text has not survived, and most of the time there are complete fantasies which are present in Megasthenes Indica. For example, one of the basic facts about Indian society, which according to Megasthenes, is that Indian society was divided into 6 categories. And I think most of us can, this is a wrong fact. The Indian society was divided into 4 categories. And if you separate the slaves as being of another category, this would mean that there were 5 categories. But I think this is stretching the point. Most scholars or most visitors who have visited India, they were quite aware of the fact that Indian society was divided into 4 categories. So here Megasthenes had this basic fact wrong, means that we cannot trust most of the descriptions of Megasthenes. So this is first point. Then these scholars, the most important point, according to those scholars who have opposed this view that the Arthashastra was written in the postmodern period. So what these scholars write is that when you analyze Arthashastra, we find that the writing of the text is quite archaic. By archaic, they mean that in this text, although it is written in Sanskrit, but there are quite a number of Prakrit elements which one can find. So the fact that we can find some Prakrit element and the language itself is quite archaic would mean that this was a text that was composed in a early period, not in the post or Gupta period. Then to buttress this argument, another important point they argue is that, now, as I have already, I think most you have, there is this argument which those who oppose the traditional view, they have presented that the points of Yajnavalkya Smriti and the legal points of Arthashastra are similar. So they argue that in Arthashastra promotes widow marriage. And in most Smritis, even in the Yajnavalkya Smriti, this was, a complete no-no, so to say. So the fact that, an important scholar or an important text like Arthashastra can have this view suggests that this text was written in an early period. Because if the text was written in the postmodern or the Gupta period, there would have been a complete agreement that widow remarriage is not allowed. Because, every Dharma Shastra has this view. But in Arthashastra, we see this was not the case. So what was the social milieu of the post and early Gupta period is quite different from the social milieu which we see in the Arthashastra. Tells us that Arthashastra was composed in a early period. Then another important point, and for me I think this is the most important point, is that when you read Arthashastra discusses minting of coins. And when it talks about coins, we get a sense that, or it is quite clear that Arthashastra is talking about punch-marked coins. Now, punch-marked coins, I think most of us know that punch-marked coins appeared in the Mahajanpad period and in the Mauryan period. By the post-Mauryan period and even in the early Gupta period, punch-marked coins had disappeared. Most of the time we see that in the post-Mauryan period and in the Gupta period, die-struck coins which were introduced by the Indo-Greeks, they had become popular. So this would mean that now if we believe that the text Arthashastra was written in the post-Mauryan or early Gupta period, I think why would Kautilya would say that would talk about punch-marked coins? He would have talked about these die-struck coins where we see the face of a particular ruler or a particular deity, but he talks about punch-marked coins. Secondly, on the coins itself, when you look at Arthashastra, there are only two types of coins that are mentioned. First are the copper coins and the second are the silver coins. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the numismatic history of India, you would know that gold coin were introduced in India by the Kushanas. The Kushanas appear at the start of Common Era. So now if the argument was that the Arthashastra was written in the early Gupta period or later Mauryan period, this would mean that Kautilya must have been familiar with gold coins, because by the time of the early Guptas, gold coins had become quite popular. So the fact that Arthashastra did not talk about gold coins means that this text is quite old, and the fact that punch-marked coins are talked about, the fact that copper and silver coins appear, means that it was of a early date. So this I think is the main point which one should remember. And about the debate itself, I think we can still cannot say with conclusive evidence that Arthashastra was written in the early Mauryan period. And even those who oppose this view, they cannot say that they are 100% sure. So I think if we are going to, what I believe is that we can at least have a sense that the original text was written in the early Mauryan period, and later some scholars have it was expanded, because although the structure didn't expand, there were certain views which later added, and the addition happened in such a way the structure didn't get destroyed. So the structure remained. And here I think the point of Patrick Olivelle is important, where Patrick Olivelle talks about Arthashastra had become part of a academic curriculum. So in order to be used as a academic curriculum, he has shown that there was certain revisions that were carried out. So what I believe is that the original structure of Arthashastra had elements that were composed in the Mauryan period, and later the main text which has come down to us, it took its final form in the post-Mauryan period. Now, last point which I think I should end this with is the location of Kautilya, or where this text was written. So for this, historians have used that references in the Arthashastra. So for example, there is this reference where we are told that Kautilya talks about coastal areas. And from this, some scholars argue that Kautilya must have wrote this text, or Kautilya was from a coastal area. Now, I think that this is not a very good point, but there are some Brahmins in the coastal region, particularly Konkan, coastal Maharashtra, Gujarat, and I think in Madhya Pradesh also, or in Andhra Pradesh, sorry, that there are some Brahmins who have this gotra called Kautilya. And some scholars believe that Kautilya must have originally from this place, and that is why we see that, or it could be could be that these Brahmins were descendants of the gotra of Kautilya, and they later migrated in this region. Whatever the case may be, so this is one aspect of Kautilya's location, or the location where Kautilya wrote his text. The most popular view is that Kautilya wrote his Arthashastra in Takshashila. So I think most of us know about this story, that Kautilya was the teacher there. So that is how he wrote his Arthashastra there. So this is the broad overview of the historical debates that we see when we talk about Arthashastra and Kautilya.